7 minutes past 4 p.m. Central African time. Welcome back. You are tuned into Salam Media. It is, of course, the weekend edition of the Iftar show, and my name is Zahid Jadwat, keeping you company until 6 p.m. this afternoon. Let's move on now to cross over to Dr. Yvonne Ridley, a British author and journalist, who's been quite regularly featured on this show for the past few weeks since the start of Ramadan, actually, bringing us the latest developments in the Muslim world. Assalamu alaikum and welcome to the show.
Walaikum salam, Zahid.
It's always a pleasure having you. How are you this afternoon?
Alhamdulillah, all is good. The fasting is still quite challenging. It's nearly about 16 hours here in Scotland, but I'm getting there.
16 hours. Wow, okay. I'm barely surviving with my I think it's 13 hours. But yeah, that's the whole point, right? It's about patience.
Yeah.
Nonetheless, let's look at some of the stories that have been making headlines across the Muslim world. And we know one of those stories, not a very pleasant, actually, not pleasant at all. And that, of course, the situation in Palestine. We've spoken about this in previous segments, but things seem to have escalated since then.
Yes, unfortunately so. I've just been reading an article by Dr. Adnan Abu Amr, who is the head of the political science department at the university in Gaza. And he is predictably blaming Israel for creating a really explosive situation at Al Aqsa, the third holiest site in Islam, and unfortunately, a site that is often targeted by the Israeli military. Um, it was about 4 or 5 days ago when I'm sure anyone who follows the social networks will have seen the shocking footage um, from that showed Israeli security forces beating Palestinian worshippers and doing it in such a vicious way. You know, if this had been happening in Kabul, the world would be outraged. But of course, it wasn't the Taliban, it was the Israeli forces, and they're held in a different level of criticism. But the brutal violence left a dozen Palestinians injured, and it fueled anger across the Muslim world because, as I said, you know, this mosque, this blessed mosque, well, it used to be the home of the first Qibla, but it's now the third holiest site in Islam. Um, the recent emergence of violence is because the Israelis are saying, well, rockets were fired from Gaza and Lebanon. Um, and so we've responded likewise. Of course, if you unravel everything and go right back to who fired the first shot or who was through the first missile, it goes right back more than 70 years to Israel's brutal invasion and seizure of occupied Palestine. So, um, you know, they're always blaming, well, they started it, they fired the first shot, when in fact what started it was the Israeli invasion of Palestinian lands. It's quite clear, as Adnan Abu Amr says, that, you know, we can't rely on the Americans to intervene. Um, you know, at one time they were regarded as the world's policemen and were able to stage interventions, but those days have gone. And as usual, the Israeli leader, the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, is desperately trying to cling on to power. Um, but we all know what's coming down the line, yet another election. And Israel has had about 5 in the last couple of years. Um, the country is polarized, it's divided and
Mm,
and unstable. So, I think another election will be coming down the line.
mm. Okay, and I'm sure I think a lot of people would then be keeping an eye on this and to see how these developments unfold further. And as you mentioned, this is something that has been a long-standing issue. It goes back decades, in fact. And yeah, certainly not
We should
a
pray
good
for
story to.
Palestine.
Yes, of
Never
course.
underestimate the power of prayer.
Of course, yeah, and I think that's what we as Muslims across the Ummah should be doing at the moment. I totally agree with you on that. Nonetheless, let's move on now to Turkey, where it seems the Americans are supposedly or apparently supporting Turkish opposition, and that, of course, ahead of some elections in that country.
Well, that's hardly a surprise. A few months ago, one of the neocons uh, was being interviewed about global matters, and he turned his attention to Turkey and said that he more or less admitted that Americans were behind the last coup when there was an attempt to overthrow Erdogan, and that was the former UN ambassador Richard Bolton. He quite openly talked about how the CIA had staged coups in various countries. That we already know; it's been well documented. But as I say, he mentioned Turkey, and he was talking about the forthcoming May elections. So it really doesn't surprise me that America is interfering in these Turkish elections. And it's about time the Americans stop this. Uh, they have a record for interfering in other people's elections. And frankly, I think I've got quite a lot of faith in the Turkish electorate, and I think they'll see through any attempts to manipulate them or coerce them into voting for the opposition. They'll vote for who they want to vote for. Um, Erdogan has had better campaigns, but then again, he hasn't had this devastating earthquake. And I don't know many leaders who could survive that, because it doesn't matter whether you live in an earthquake zone or not. Each one is different, each one is devastating, and it is hard to prepare for these natural man-made, well, they're not man-made, but these natural disasters.
Mm,
And of course, the Americans don't like the way Erdogan will um, speak out vocally, usually on behalf of Muslims. And of course, he has not interfered, but he has spoken out, calling in a telephone call to the Israeli president, telling him to dial down the violence and to discuss the rising tensions on Temple Mount.
mm,
So, um, as I say, I have a lot more trust in the Turkish voters than the Americans do. They can see when they're being manipulated.
mm. All right, and then of course something happening in Yemen at the moment. So Saudi delegations have arrived in the capital there. and they holding talks with the head of the Houthi group and hoping for permanent ceasefire.
Well, I think we're in the unusual position of having to thank China for bringing peace talks between Iran and Saudi, who have been fighting this devastating proxy war in Yemen. And the Saudi Houthi talks are now bringing hope of a ceasefire. And my goodness, if any country in the world should feel neglected at the moment, it would be Yemen, because this unfolding disaster has created the deaths of tens of thousands of Yemenis, and I think it's 80% of the country is now relying upon aid, and children are dying of malnutrition. You know, it's the 21st century, and
Mm.
children are dying of malnutrition. It's terrible. There's been no official confirmation yet by the Saudis, but Houthi outlets say that both the Saudi and Omani delegations are in Sana'a as we broadcast right now. And there is a leaked photo which shows the Houthi leader Mohammed Ali al-Houthi shaking the hand of a Saudi official. We can't quite see his face because that's obscured, but this is all very, delicate negotiations. But as I say, I think we have to thank China for its intervention. And, this is what superpowers should be doing, not feeding wars like we're seeing in Ukraine, but trying to prevent wars, or trying to
Mm.
get both sides to sit down and talk. So
Mm.
again, it's prayer time for Yemen.
Let's hope for the best outcome for that. I mean, this is something that the Yemenis have probably been hoping for quite a long time. And I think if this has to fail and not succeed, that is going to be a devastating blow to the Yemenis. I mean, how much more are they expected to bear? Uh, yeah, so let's hope for the best on that. But nonetheless, we'll leave it at that for this week. Thank you so much for your time.
Well, thank you very much. And I wish all your listeners peace and blessings at
I
this
mean,
time of month.
yes, of course. That was Dr. Yvonne Ridley, who is a British journalist and author, speaking to us about the various developments in the Muslim world as we speak today. And that, of course, brings us to 40 minutes past 4 p.m.